Coming up, another Hard Knocks episode in the books for the New York Football Giants, and we break down everything from the combine takeaways to the negotiations with Saquon Barkley and pursuing Brian Burns. We dive in coming up next. Yes, my friends, it's OGP, the One Giant podcast, where you know that we are your host. Over here, Adam Arbrecht, over there, Andrew Makowitz. We're healthy, we're wealthy, we're wise. We're talking takeaways from episode 2 from Hard Knocks. Another sample, Andy, where it's a lot of fluff and maybe not terribly insightful for the Giants organization, but some interesting threads to pull on for sure. And my biggest goal here is to blow right past the Saquon Barkley stuff and talk about the combine, Brian Daboll, Joe Schoen, and of course the Wilkins Burns situation. But viewers, Andy will not afford me to do that without getting at least one Saquon question in.
I just have one question for you,
Okay.
and it's the only thing that I care about. I don't care about the dialogue, how Saquon sounded, was he in a good mood or a bad mood. None of that matters to me. The only thing that actually matters to me is they opened it up with the change in how much salary cap the NFL was allowing each team to have. And it was interesting to see, like, wow, maybe we can, go after some positions of need, or maybe that changes what happens with X. You don't hear like, well, now we can sign Saquon Barkley. My question to you is, do you think that the salary cap going up is one of the largest reasons why Saquon is not a Giant anymore? Or do you think it doesn't matter what the salary cap was going to be, Saquon was never coming back to the team?
I don't think it matters, because if you hadn't had the increased salary, I think that the Joe Schoen mentioned like 144, 147 was around what they thought it was going to be. It gets up to 155. So there's more room to play with there.
244.
240, yeah. 144, and we
thought
the
100 million between friends, Adam.
Hard decisions here. Going to be hard to get our team together. But so you increase the salary, which means, okay, technically we can go back to the table with Saquon Barkley. If you didn't have the extra money, there's no way you're bringing them back, because you would have been absolutely hamstrung from a financial standpoint. Having more cap space, again, I just don't look at it, because Xavier McKinney would fall into this category too of players that we had on our roster. We have a lot of needs, and Joe Schoen mentions it. We have a lot of holes to fill. So just because we get more cap, he said it makes it really gets me excited about what we could possibly do. He didn't say it makes me really excited about bringing back Saquon Barkley now. It opens up possibilities. I will stand by this. Joe Schoen did not want to re-sign Saquon Barkley. Saquon Barkley did not want to be a New York Football Giant anymore. It's okay. Like, it's okay for that to be the case. I want to keep trying to find these nooks and crannies, not you, but in general, find these nooks and crannies of like, oh, maybe if it looks like Joe Schoen was willing to offer X, he was threading the needle of doing just enough so that it didn't look bad when Saquon Barkley left.
So the only thing I was going to suggest was, I think the salary cap going up made it significantly less likely that Saquon Barkley was going to sign with the Giants, because I don't think it impacted Joe Schoen's perception of how much he'd be willing to pay Saquon. But I think other teams looked and said, oh, if we have a couple extra million in the cupboard and we're a playmaker away from doing something like the Philadelphia Eagles, maybe that gave them $1 million or $2 million more, which completely outpriced what Joe Schoen was. So I thought it was fascinating that he was talking about whether they could afford X, or whether there were some interior defensive linemen that we'll talk about later that were maybe a higher priority. It was just fascinating to me to think that the salary cap going up, you're like, oh, that means you can sign your free agents, you have more cap space. When in fact, I just think it made sure that the writing was on the wall for Saquon, that another team would shell out the additional money to have him.
Yeah, really good point that other teams go, oh, maybe we have just enough here to make something happen. Obviously, it ends up being the Philadelphia Eagles. We'll talk more about that, as, of course, every single episode ends with a cliffhanger of what's the next phase of the Saquon Barkley conversation and negotiations. Fast forward, we all know he's not on the team. So you're giving us a tease around a story we already know the ending to. Other interesting things, though, here. Going into the combine, obviously, you get a lot of great interviews, some stuff with Brian Daboll here, too, in terms of how he approaches looking at these different positions. There are a couple of key elements here. I want to fast forward beyond the interviews just for a second, because the one thing that the Giants were willing to put in here, or that Hard Knocks put into this, was just the voice of Joe Schoen talking with someone from the Patriots about the number 3 overall pick and just confirming, hey, if you feel like you may make a move, we don't know what we're going to do, but keep us in your back pocket. Keep us in mind. We'd love to just at least get the phone call if you choose to make a decision at the 3rd overall pick. That tells you kind of everything you need to know, going also into the fact that they interviewed all of these top quarterbacks as well, that the Giants were interested and considering and wanting to look at getting up the board potentially here. I'm sure we'll learn more going forward, but that's the first step in being willing to look at the quarterback position potentially.
If I could sit down with Joe Schoen and I could ask him a couple of questions there
Sure.
without asking, like, would you have drafted Drake May? Obviously, like my two questions are this: is first one is, did that conversation with the New England Patriots happen before you interviewed Drake May or after you interviewed Drake May? Because to me, that actually would be fascinating. If it's before, Joe Schoen could be like, hey, we were just doing our due diligence. Maybe we wanted Marvin Harrison. Maybe we wanted this. Maybe we wanted that. You could maybe squint enough and be like, okay, that's fair. But if it was after they interviewed Drake May and you see him like a wizard at the draft board, and they're like, man, we could get him with the 3rd pick if we go talk to New England. He's like, I know they're across the entire arena, but let me go like plant the seed that we are interested in it.
Yeah.
So for me, I think this sequential order of events actually would be the most interesting for me, that Hard Knocks doesn't necessarily give you the full representation of.
By the way, too, before we get into the combine stuff and Brian Daboll, one thing on Joe Schoen. So for better or worse, we've always talked about Joe Schoen. He seems like he's pretty straightforward. He's willing to be pretty honest about, what's going on. Sometimes we've even said over his tenure, oh, is it too much of an overshare here or there? There is the great sequence before he goes out the combine for the interview, and he's there with the PR guy for the Giants. And they're talking about, all right, obviously Saquon's going to be a theme here. And you do get the good clip. And this is, again, where I go back to that Joe Schoen was done with this aspect of the decision-making process when it came to the running back room. I wanted to give him a lot of money a year ago, but he didn't want that. This is we're talking to the PR guy. And he takes a long pause. And he goes, no, I'm not going to say it. I'm not going to say that.
PR guy's like, whatever you do, don't do that. Don't.
He's like, yeah, don't worry. I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And then they blend a great sequence of talking about something. He's starting to rehearse kind of the way that he wants to deliver it, and it blends right into the microphone. That to me actually was insightful around the idea of performative might be the wrong word, not just for Joe Schoen, but for teams overall. But it's understood, man. The messaging that we're putting out there, it's not just, hey, make sure you don't say this, stay away from that. This is our general perspective. He's sitting there having a one-on-one kind of, this is debate prep interview skill sets here where it's like, now when you get out there, if they try to push you this way, remember, we want to go ahead and steer that conversation about assets and future building. If they ask you about Saquon Barkley, we're going to say, well, of course, we appreciate him as a player. We want him, like all of those things are going to come up. I thought that part of it was interesting. And the more that I watch Hard Knocks, I will say the more that I think Joe Schoen maybe gets the gamut a little bit more than we wanted to give him credit for. I don't think he looks great in it. I think he looks kind of like, a little podunk coming in from the Midwest and, aw shucks attitude. But it's interesting to see the way that he's been handling a lot of this stuff.
You said performance, and I agree with you that that's not the right word. Preparedness was the word that came to my mind, where it's like, they really button this up. It's like if you've ever given a presentation or a speech in front of a large audience, you run it by your significant other, you read it in the mirror, you just make sure that the key words that you want to focus on. And yeah, I thought that was fascinating. I think you can see that Joe Schoen is poised. The director of communications let him get out what he really wants to say. He's like, I've tried a million times to pay Saquon. He doesn't want the money that I'm giving him. He wants some crazy contract. We're not going to give it to him. He's got to go elsewhere. But I'm not going to say that, right? And so I thought that was fascinating as well. Do you think Joe Schoen went to New England and also other teams and was like, hey, we're interested in trading up to 2, and Washington's like, go away, or hey, we want to go to 4, and Arizona's like, we're locked in on Marvin Harrison. They conveniently only show 3, which indicates that the Giants had an interest in Drake May, if you're reading the tea leaves the way that they laid it out.
Well, the other thing that I'll give you, going back to episode 1 as well, and the Brian Burns stuff that we're going to talk about here too. The other thing that I get the sense of Joe Schoen is when he's walking around these rooms, and again, I'm saying this about Joe Schoen, he's the Giants GM. I'm sure a lot of GMs are doing this, but he's kind of walking around. He's like, hey, what are you doing? Hey, what do you got going on tonight? Like, it's a lot of just kind of like sending out the flyer. That's the Brian Burns thing. Again, those two guys have connections outside of football, so we know maybe they already had conversations even before what you see get filmed. But it's just kind of, hey, like, oh, what are you thinking about this guy? Well, we're trying to move off of him. From a high level in the NFL, I think it takes away from a fan perspective some of that passion and that fire and that dedication to players. And these are our guys, and we want to go and we want to have this core be who wins for us. Then there's like the asset management side, and you're just like, well, I was adding up the cost and balance sheet here, and it looks like we need to move some assets. Burns is probably not in our future. What do you think? Couple bales of hay and a few picks sounds good. Like, the conversations are so casual that I would assume, to your question, that Joe Schoen was probably talking to anybody. And I don't mean that negatively. Anytime he saw a GM, he's probably like, hey, how's it going? What are you guys doing? What pick are you at? And a lot of it is playing a little bit, I think, coy too with one another. Oh, that's right. What are you at? Pick 6? Like, someone said that back to Joe Schoen. They're like, you know what pick we're at. Like, knock it off. Like, and if you don't, shame on you for not having a sense of where the board is as you're having these conversations. So I think 100% you need to always be fishing, because you don't know when something kind of out of nowhere is going to develop and turn into, as we'll talk about, maybe Brian Burns, right?
Well, you see him talking to Dan Morgan, the GM of the Carolina Panthers. That's how the Brian Burns thing started. It was like a little joke of like, who wants to move, who wants to shake. You hear Brandon Beane, the GM of the Buffalo Bills, say, we don't got the assets. If anything, we're going to trade back. And guess what? The Buffalo Bills did. They traded
Right.
back with the Kansas City Chiefs.
Right.
So, like, even when you're kind of joking around, they all kind of know what everyone's thinking, or what, at a high level everyone wants to do. Like, when he said that to Joe Schoen and Dan Morgan, he was dead serious. He's like, I don't have the assets to move up. If anything, I need to get more assets.
Yeah.
And it showed to be come to fruition. And to your point, Adam, like, good GMs ask every single question they possibly can without giving out as much information or committing to anything that they need to do. So Joe Schoen's asking everyone, Brandon, you want to move up? You want to give me Josh Allen and move up? Sure, that sounds great for us, right? You don't know unless you ask. And it seemed like Joe Schoen is really good at, using his connections and kind of making it funny off the cuff, and just, posing hypotheticals, propositions, and seeing what sticks.
Hey, man, you show up to the dance, right? You show up to the prom. You don't get to dance unless you start asking the ladies if they want to get on the floor with you. Joe Schoen, he's out there cutting rugs. We'll get into Brian Daboll and some of this interview process of the combine, which I did find fascinating, before talking about Wilkins and Burns here, coming up in just one moment. All right, so as we continue today's OGP, reminder, you can go back yesterday, did a live session in the afternoon talking about the top young cores under 25. The Giants for ESPN fell from 6 down to 13. That's because a guy like Andrew Thomas graduated out of the under 25 category. But is that young core ready to take the next big step? There's some question mark players there. Go check that one out over on YouTube or your podcast feeds as well. But when it comes to the combine and it comes to these interviews, Andy, going through a lot of different things here, let's just start with Brian Daboll and talking about the quarterback room. Listen, whether it's Daniels, May, Williams, McCarthy, there's some interesting things that I thought that came out of that on a high level. Not yet a leader when they talked about Daniels. And that's the one thing that jumped off the screen. They also were complimentary of him. The mentals for May was the big one they talked about. Caleb Williams, adversity, checks all the boxes, had a winning stretch in his college season, also lost a lot of games. Didn't like the fact that he refused to talk after a loss. You had the assistant GM saying to Joe Schoen, that's just not going to fly in New York when it comes to having that type of personality. McCarthy, last note, has the right to check and kill plays the line, but the offensive line called the protections and identified those. I thought that was the insight around young kid doing some things, but probably is a both and here about responsibilities being shared in terms of how he was able to be productive. And that's when you get to Brian Daboll and you get to the way that he interviews these quarterbacks and try to get a sense about where they are, understanding play calling, understanding rhythm, quickness, pivoting, all of those things.
Yeah, and it's no accident the way the Giants set it up, with Joe Schoen sitting next to Brian Daboll and Brian Daboll being able to do the interview process. Yeah. I don't think Joe Schoen has it in him to be able to be like fiery or put a guy on the spot or make him feel super uncomfortable. That's just not the personality that Joe Schoen has. Brian Daboll, on the other hand, like, he's been so fiery that Joe Schoen's had to dial into the headset during games to be like, stop yelling at your coordinators.
Right.
And it, to me, it was fascinating to see the different dichotomy of all of these different quarterbacks and what they excelled in or what the concerns were. I didn't know the JJ McCarthy stuff until I saw it there. And I was like, that's interesting. Like, are you betting your future on a guy that hasn't even figured out pass protection in the college level? Like, could he do it? Sure. He hasn't done it. So that's a question mark. The Caleb Williams thing is like, I think they looked at, they're like, we can't have a guy that we don't know if he can stand up at the podium after a loss and like
course.
deal with the Post and the Daily News and all the stuff that comes with it. And it is different playing in New York than it is, say, playing in, I don't know, Houston, right? Like
Mhm.
it's a little bit easier to play somewhere else where the lights aren't maybe as bright. The Jaden Daniels thing I thought was interesting. They
By the
really
way,
were.
just real quick, it's also good to put a little seed of like, oh, I don't know if he's ready to play in this type of big city. He's likely to go number 1 overall, and we're not going to have a chance to draft him. Never hurts to set the baseline that I might be a little concerned there on this player.
Right. It's a win-win. It's like we couldn't have gotten him. The Bears were never trading out, but it was also like in our diligence, we actually had this Drake May number 1,
Right,
like,
right.
because we were never going to trade up. The only other two things I thought about Daboll, which I found fascinating, is it seemed like he was really pushing Jaden Daniels more than the other ones in terms of like hitting him hard with the questions, making him
Yeah.
change some of the different positions, telling him like when you go 0-3 and you face adversity, who do you go to? What do you do? In the middle of the thing, he stops him. He's like, tell me the play all over again, seeing like if he remembers it, high pressure situations, what happens. It looked like Jaden Daniels was a little bit uncomfortable, was struggling, couldn't repeat it back verbatim. It's hard because over the last couple of years in the LSU system, he's had completely different vernacular. So to learn it like on the fly, it was a little bit tough for him. And like where he
Well,
wanted the
and
ball to go.
the one spot when he says, and then what do I, if that's what we go with, and what do I want you to do most likely? And he was like, throw a touchdown. And he was like, hey, I like that answer. But now I like that answer. But what I'm really looking for is like, no, I meant like break down
The
the
Y
play
out
and
to the
what do
flat
you
is
look to
actually the
first?
play
Yeah,
preferred
where
play
yeah,
for us on the
right.
fade
Like
because
yes,
you
yes.
realize it has the least amount of risk. We'll take the chunk play. There's no coverage over here. Like he wants
Right,
him to
right.
diagnose that. Like throw a touchdown feels like the
Sexy. It
answer of
was
a
a
guy that's
sexy
like,
answer.
I'm just going to sling it whenever. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, sometimes we need you to just make the right play at the right time. And so I thought that was fascinating. I walked away from the Jane Daniels thing being like, I don't know if he's the type of guy that the Giants would want based on his traits, the way that he plays. Like I don't. I walked away from that thinking that they would shy away from him, and walked away from the Drake May thing, where Drake May was like a wizard repeating things back, changing the vernacular, understanding every concept that was going on.
Right.
And I was like, man, I think if the Giants could get Drake May, it feels like he had that level of understanding conceptually of what they want to do. That then Brian Daboll's like, great, he understands that. Now I just need to coach him into exactly what I want him to do.
Yeah, interestingly enough, future episode that we're going to be doing is there's been a lot of interviews with Giants personnel in the offseason as they're there. You can check them out, full Giants giving full coverage to offensive line and everything else. But a lot of these reference points are about like the offensive system and how complicated it is. Like there's a lot going on in a Brian Daboll offensive scheme. And that's why if you're looking at one of these QBs, you have to be talking about like, hey, are you going to be able to come in and digest this and grow with it? You don't have to be perfect when you're in these combine interviews, but just getting a sense that you understand it, you can pick it up and you can send it back to Brian Daboll, obviously, as well. The other group of players that we got into here then when it comes to the New York Football Giants and the combine is obviously the wide receiver room. And you got the three guys. Again, I'll do the same thing that we did with the quarterbacks there. Nabors, highly passionate, trains hard, plays with a chip on his shoulder, wants his targets. Rome Odunze, alpha, high energy, smart, tough, dependable. The Giants used their own key words to describe him. And then you obviously have Marvin Harrison Jr., high character, high pedigree, great personality, great demeanor. He was asked just very briefly. They were like, this play here. They're like trying to bait him into talking trash about the quarterback. And they're like, it's obviously a bad throw though. He goes, I can make a play. There's like, what are you coming back and saying to the quarterback after? He goes, nothing, so let's go ahead. Let's run it again. And that's my opportunity. That's my goal. But the one thing that I thought I separated him from, and who cares, because he was the number one wide receiver prospect. It got debated for a little bit, maybe with Malik Nabors down the stretch, is he seemed so casually confident in who he was and what he's about that I wondered like how the Giants took that in. They're like, you gonna do anything? He goes, nah, like I've been working all the way to get to this point. I'm ready to be a pro. I'm thinking about September. I'm thinking about week 1. Like, I don't care about this in a lot of ways. I don't mean that negatively, but he was not really engaged in the process of being there. Happy, good guy, great takeaways. The small snippet we got was just a dude who's like, man, let's get to the draft. I'm the first wide receiver getting taken.
Well, it's interesting because I also heard people talk about like what number one wide receiver isn't kind of a deep
100%. That's what I mean. These aren't knocks in any way, shape, or form.
I mean, you look at a guy like Larry Fitzgerald, he's like one of the few that breaks that mold where you're like, he didn't complain. He played for the same team his entire career and is basically a Hall of Famer. So It seems like that's the exception to the rule, not actually what you're looking for. I had an interesting nugget on all three.
Yeah.
The Malik Nabors one is like, he's explosive. He definitely has the highest ceiling and definitely has the lowest floor in terms of like, he could be a top 3 wide receiver in this league year one. Like I am convinced on that. He could also like have something happen or gets angry or gets frustrated and demand a trade in year 2 or year 3. Like I think he's got that volatility to him. I think Marvin Harrison, I felt like if you had like a heart monitor on him, there was like, was the pulse going up and down at all? Or was he just like, yeah, I'm going to play football. Someone's going to draft me. I'm going to make money. And like, that's what it's going to be. I don't mean that. I don't mean that disparagingly, but I kind of was like, he doesn't feel, his play is alpha, but he doesn't feel like an alpha when he's talking, but maybe he's like, talk less, do more.
100%. And the same thing with Nabors, right? Like they said, like, oh, like we were surprised that for the way that Malik Nabors plays on the field, he seemed different off the field in a positive way. And then now, so first on Rome Odunze, okay, because we got to get this out of the way. I am really excited about Malik Nabors, but if you watch this show, you know that Andy and I were both getting pretty jacked up around the idea of Rome Odunze. We talked a lot about maybe Giants making marginal trade downs and still being able to get him. So not only when we talk about the key bullet points around him, certainly an alpha player, high energy guy, smart, tough, dependable, very smart football IQ. And then when they asked him, like, what are you bringing if we were to draft you? It was, I'm going to come in the locker room. I'm going to bring everybody along with me. I'm a leader on the field, off the field. I believe community is important. Like, he checked every single box you would want. Does he have the skill set, the flash skill set of a Marvin Harrison Jr. or Malik Nabors? No. Will he have as big a career as either one of those wide receivers? It won't be hard to say no. But based on our excitement around him going into the combine and towards the draft and that type of interview, I'll put it this way. If I had been the assistant GM in the room, I'd be like, oh, come on, guys. Come on. What are we doing? What are we doing, guys? Come on. Rome Odunze, like, let's go. And that's the wrong way to evaluate talent because the on-field product matters as much as anything. And that's not taken away from him because, as we know, going back to the combine, Rome Odunze put on an absolute show in the absence of Malik Nabors or Marvin Harrison Jr. actually running through any of those drills.
I mean, it was hard to watch for me. I'm not Adam, I can't tell a lie.
It was my boy.
The thing that gets me, which I still listen, Malik Nabors has the explosive traits, and that's obviously why he's so desirable. And I'm happy that we have a number 1 wide receiver that can take the top off of a defense. This is not necessarily about Malik Nabors as much as it is about Rome Odunze. You can't watch that like minute and a half clip of Rome Odunze and not be like, that guy's impressive, right? And people will say, well, that's off the field, Andy. Like, who cares about that? But he also matched that off the field stuff with the on the field production, with the size, with the measurables, with the 4.47 speed. He had everything that you wanted. And Adam, the reason why I think you and I were both so confident is they literally, you mentioned one of the area scouts had said, smart, tough, dependable are his 3 attributes. And the Giants themselves say those are the 3 most important attributes. It's why I don't understand why the Giants ultimately did not draft him. Because if you go through the process, like he literally fits everything that they need. And so my question to you is, like, I kind of got the sense that if it was solely up to Joe Schoen, Rome Odunze is a New York Giant.
Yep.
But because Brian Daboll was like, did you watch? I watched that tape of that guy Nabors, and let me tell you, it's explosive. And maybe Mike Kafka, maybe the wide receiver coach, everyone's looking at it being like, guys, I know that smart, tough, dependable thing is like what we care about, but this guy has the chance to be like a Tyreek Hill or like a Justin Jefferson next year. And so my question to you is, did you feel the same way where it's like, if Joe Schoen had full autonomy and didn't take advice from his coaching staff, I think Rome Odunze is a Giant.
Well, Joe Schoen does have full autonomy. Like he could have said,
I don't think he does.
That cannot be true. You're taking in the influence. I'm saying it's ultimately his call. If he said, I hear what you're saying, and we've talked about Rome Odunze, we talked about Marvin Harrison Jr., and we're going to go with Rome Odunze for all of these reasons. And by the way, it's not walking in the room and saying like, hey, Brian Daboll, do you hate Rome Odunze? And he goes, yeah, kind of do. And he goes, all right, we're going to take him. Like, it's not like that. Like they live in this spectrum here. I think the Brian Daboll influence, to your point, hey, I'm advocating for this player, right? This is the guy that I believe unlocks this offense. But if you are in a positive way, if you're Joe Schoen, you're saying, hey, man, it's me and Brian Daboll. We're in this thing together. Even if people want to compartmentalize this a little bit and say, is Brian Daboll's job on the line versus my job going forward here, whatever. That separation I don't think exists here. So I think Joe Schoen is sitting there saying, like, he wants to serve the needs of his coaching staff and how they want to build this. We saw this with Shane Bowen. You tell us what you want, what you need, and how you want to build it out. We're going to talk about it with Brian Burns, right? So I think it matters. But if ultimately, I guess my point would be, Joe Schoen had to look at this and say, I see Malik Nabors as being percentage points better as an on-field player than Rome Odunze. I see Rome Odunze as being locker room, smart, tough, dependable, percentage points higher. But guess what? The talent on the field is always going to weigh itself out. And assistant GM also was pointing this out too. He's like, listen, man, like, everybody's got something. Everybody's got a little something in their background, a little something off the field. He's like, I kind of want a little bit of that. So there is this world where everybody else was like, dude, Malik Nabors, let's roll. And Joe Schoen was debating or deliberating the idea of like, or do I want this player? And by the way, real quick, another LSU product. This is the Giants organization in terms of the way that they build themselves. Probably the same discussions happened with Odell Beckham Jr. back then about, yeah, man, this dude's obviously elite. Is he the full team guy? Is he going to be a leader in the locker room? It's like, yeah, well, guess what? It kind of doesn't matter because look at the tape. And that usually, for I think every organization, overrides a lot of other stuff.
I agree. The buck stops with Joe Schoen. That is his reason for being the general manager. However, you can see that he's like, hey, Shane, what do you think about that guy, Brian Burns? And he's like,
oh, of course. Yeah. Because he wants everyone to
like that guy, Brian Burns, Joe. And it's like, if he said, you know what? Brian doesn't really fit what I'm trying to do here, Joe. Do you think Joe's well, there was too much value, so you're going to have to figure it out. Sorry. I don't think he would do that. And so if the area scouts and Brandon Brown, the assistant GM, and Brian Daboll and Mike Kafka are like, we love Rome Odunze. He's great, Joe. But like, we all have Malik Nabors ranked higher. So if you want Rome Odunze, you kind of have to overrule everyone else that has done all this evaluation for you. And that's just not the way that Joe Schoen has it. But I think in a vacuum, that was my point more. Like, Joe Schoen might have.
By the way, you're not going to have Shane Bowen say, I'm not a big fan of Brian Burns. Be like, yeah, well, guess what? You're going to eat it and you're going to like it. Like, of course,
exactly.
But, so, and that's what I think is interesting about Rome, because there's probably nobody in that room that was saying we don't like Rome Odunze. It's just about what we think Malik Nabors is going to unlock for this offense. So, dude, it's that part of it, which again goes unseen here, which I can understand why maybe you would. And we're not even at the draft yet, so that could be a future episode coming up. That debate may be the thing that we watch for here, because that part is fascinating. And I think that, not that you would think anything else, but 30 people in a room, we're all going to agree on how the board. No, of course not.
Right.
Wide receiver positional coach is going to think one thing. Offensive line coach is going to think another. A coordinator versus a skill position. Like, all these people are going to be in there with their voices. And then down to the scout level where it's like, well, I'm the guy that went and saw Rome Odunze. Like, I know, you know what I mean? You're going to keep pushing and advocating for your guy. But ultimately, you hope that what ends up happening is consensus. And maybe to your point, Joe Schoen looks at it and goes, okay, what does it feel like consensus is here? I'm not going to be the guy. This feels like a Dave Gettleman kind of trait that shoves Saquon Barkley drafting second overall down everyone's throat because I've come up with something in my mind. That being the case, the one other quick little tidbit before we talk about Wilkins and Burns is just that Brian Daboll did at one point in the Nabors interview when he's like, yeah, man, like I want that ball. Like, I'm going to be frustrated because I believe I worked. And I like this answer from Nabors too. I worked on it all week. You practice all these things, these plays that are there for me. And then if I don't get them, I'm going to be frustrated. When Brian Daboll says like, hey man, that's all right, I'll keep it clean. Shoot, I get pissed too. The exchange with Joe Schoen being like a half a seat behind him, where he gave him a look, kind of a little bit of a smirk, like, hey, we've been through some rough roads together, and they gave him a little pat on the shoulder. It almost felt like he was like, yeah, man, we don't want to do that anymore, though. We don't want to be losing our S anymore when it comes to being the head coach of the New York Football Giants.
Yeah, I noticed that, where it's like, Joe, I don't know if Dabes, I don't know if that's the way we want to do this after like all this turmoil and like the way Wink Martindale left and like Kafka looking at jobs and like me having to be on the headset in the middle of the season because you were yelling at people. Like, I don't know if we want to say like losing the cool the way that you do is okay. So like, maybe let's just bring that back. But obviously Dabes was just trying to relate to Malik Nabors and be like, hey, it's okay. Like, he wants him to be comfortable so he answers the questions more honestly. But I found that hilarious where like, I think Daboll was kind of looking at him and being like, oh no, yeah, you and me will get along because You're going to yell when you don't get it because you care, and that's what I do, right?
Yeah, coming up here in a second. There's more meat on that bone for sure here when it comes to the upcoming season and maybe the way that we think about how Daniel Jones is going to be under pressure in the upcoming year. But in a second, the Brian Burns, we know what happened ultimately. The Giants make the trade. But there's something worth noting here because Christian Wilkins' name keeps coming up over the course of Hard Knocks, and there clearly must have been a debate going on inside of the Giants organization. Let's break that down to close things out in just one moment. All right, so as we tie a bow on today's One Giant podcast, we let you know that it's also brought to you by our friends over at Personam, an AI cyber threat detection engine. Personam it allows you, to improve your vision into your network security environment and also lets you see cyber threats that other tools and platforms simply cannot do. Personam is always vigilant, always learning. Check out Personam today. Okay, last note here from this episode, and again, this is going to keep carrying through here. Ask Shane Bowen, hey, man, a little bit of Brian Burns action here. What do you think? Hey, that'd be pretty good for us. Now, if we go in direction A, we're not going to go with possibility B. If we were to bring back, they tied this to Saquon. If we bring back Saquon, then pursuing, at the time, they say, a Wilkins on the market is going to be obviously going to be harder for us to accomplish. So my question to you, Andy, is, when you look back at this now and know that ultimately Wilkins ends up signing with the Raiders a 4-year, $110 million deal, a little over $27 million. He's 28 years old, just over 26 years old is Brian Burns. They obviously make the trade for him where they send out a 2024 second and fifth round selection, 39 and 141, and a 2025 conditional fifth for Brian Burns and a 2024 fourth rounder, 166, that turns into Theo Johnson. Is there any part of you that just has this internal debate around, sign a free agent outright and keep draft picks in your room versus going getting Brian Burns? Different players, different skill sets, and different impact when we talk about the Giants defense.
No. So the short answer is no. I like the path that the Giants and Joe Schoen and Brandon Brown and the organization decided to go with Brian Burns. We obviously know that the Giants need someone on the other side to complement Kayvon Thibodeau. They want to be able to get to the quarterback one-on-one. It wouldn't have been the worst thing in the world to get Christian Wilkins and say, good luck guarding that interior of the defensive line. Like, that is going to be a mess. And then you potentially think about the way you construct the roster and go through the draft a little differently in that regard. You have that extra second round pick that you didn't have to give up for Brian Burns. So I understand the logic. There's a couple things, though, Adam. First is Brian Burns is younger. He's a couple years younger than Christian Wilkins. Yep. Second is their average annual salary is only a couple $100,000. I think it's $700,000 each year, either way.
Yeah, money no difference, really.
Yeah, the guaranteed money was $4 or $5 million different. The Giants actually have more years than the Christian Wilkins contract does, but they have about the same guaranteed money. So it's like the risk isn't there for the fifth year, I think, for the Giants because they can get out of it. Really, the deal is like a 3-year, $90 million deal with Brian Burns, and he's only 26 years old right now. There's one key thing that I think is also missing in this equation, Adam, and it is if the Giants would have done the deal with Wilkins as opposed to the sign and trade that they did with Brian Burns, they wouldn't also get their compensatory pick that they're supposed to get next season. The Giants are projected right now to get a fourth-round pick as a result of having more contracts go out the door than you signed inward. And so when you think about the capital that kind of moved around, the Giants are actually, a 2-year younger, massive pass rusher that could get to the quarterback for about the same money, longer term commitment, but like less guarantee, more flexibility. And the draft capital is slightly, skewed towards giving more for Brian Burns. To me, I really like the approach when you put all of the factors involved in it.
Well, by the way, I don't disagree. Like, I like having Brian Burns, and I think the Azeez Ojulari of all of this is very clear here. It's very evident. The Giants do not have he's not getting mentioned ever in the Hard Knocks episodes when they talk about the defense. He's a non-factor, and Brian Burns was obviously targeted and brought in here because you needed to have that complement to Thibodeau. Like, it's very clear that Azeez Ojulari has not lived up to that bill. That being said, the basically close, like the only difference here, man, is second-round picks, high second-round picks do not just kind of grow on trees, right? Like, so the extra fourth rounder compensatory, potentially, that's interesting. Theo Johnson works out, it obviously feels like that a little bit too. You gave out the 5th rounder going the other way as well. And we already heard a little tease about that negotiation where it sounds like Carolina wanted and a 7th rounder. And you hear Joe Schoen, I think the preview was, what, I got thrown a 7th rounder now too? Like, what are we doing? So
Come on,
the
Dan, what are we
negotiation
doing here?
table is going to be a fun one. What I'll bring up is specifically for us and how we looked at this draft coming in. When you go in and look at it and you go from pick 39 and below, and this isn't about, oh, how else could the board have fallen if things were different? It's right in the wheelhouse of starting with the Eagles at 40 with Cooper DeJean. You have Kool-Aid McKinstry goes to the Saints. You have Kamari Lassiter, your guy, who goes to Houston. You have a guy that I was high on out of Rutgers and Max Melton. Like, okay, point stop. You have 4 cornerbacks that you're talking about right now as we look at, and I talked about these with the under 25 group. Cordell Flott, is he ready to step up? Do the Giants end up having to go out to the market and bring in another veteran cornerback? It factors in here, just long-term thinking about that position and how it's going to play itself out. Go the layer deeper on the way that the draft board played itself out. You only have to go, for me personally, to the 45th pick in the Green Bay Packers with Edgerrin Cooper. We talked about the linebacker room, the complement alongside of Bobby Okereke. It's not knocking Micah McFadden, but there's almost no depth there, or at least no guarantee of depth with a lot of injuries. And then last but not least, if you buy into it, which I don't think you or I necessarily do, but the Jonathan Brooks of it all is also out there as well. We're going to lose Saquon Barkley. We want to replace him. Does Joe Schoen have to appease John Mara and draft a high running back? Didn't seem like Joe Schoen was interested in that. But just when you talk about that pocket of players, and we talked about this when the Giants came up and ultimately drafted Tyler Nubin, like, it was great. We liked the player. But we said, oh, we just missed out on that entire cornerback room. And that was really big circle, double underline need for the Giants going into this draft class. So that part of it's interesting to me. And I think if one of those guys turns out to be a high value player, we'll have a different conversation.
Yeah, but Adam, you heard Joe Schoen. He'll just play corner, right? Like he'll just
Just
jump out there and
I'll
play
just get
corner
out.
in Shane Bowen's system. He's basically like, Shane, I'm just letting you know, if we go and get Brian Burns, you're getting nothing else. Like the cupboard is bare for us because we're gonna have to give up assets and we're gonna have to pay him the most money on the defensive side of the ball. He's getting more money than Dexter Lawrence is. So if you want this guy, if your philosophy is pass rusher, that's it. You can't complain that you didn't coach up the cornerback number 2. You can't complain that there's no depth behind Bobby Okereke and Micah McFadden. Like, you could tell that was Joe Schoen joking, but it was like, ha 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 ha, not joking, but not joking, right?
And by the way, it would have been the same thing if they had signed Wilkins. It would have been, hey, like, that's the guy. Like, now Dexter Lawrence and him, like, watch your back. And I really think too, from a Shane Bowen perspective, how did that all fit together in terms of the best value? And again, that equation is fascinating to me. Wilkins outright, no extra capital, go to the draft, get extra defensive player X or Y, or Brian Burns and what that means going forward. And when you already have Thibodeau in the door, listen, you want to pull on the thread that Andy, I'm giving you credit for this in case it comes to pass. Andy has also suggested long-term, do we know for a fact that Kayvon Thibodeau will be here forever? I think that's far less likely that he's not a Giant long-term, but big money tied in there. You at least set yourself up where you have these contracts that overlap one another. It's always a big part of how you try to construct your team. So I just found it fascinating. And I think if we see any one of those cornerbacks be elite early in their careers, if we see Edgerrin Cooper really shine, then I think we'll come back to this. And there's a lot of pressure on Brian Burns to come in, be a leader, be dominant, make life easier for those other players on the defensive front. Like, this is, hey, we paid you to be a defensive changer for us because we've had talent, but we haven't been able to sustain that and be able to win football games. Now we have one more body up front that hopefully makes life easier.
At the end of the day, Adam, we started with a burning question. We're going to end with a burning question to you. Okay. It is the number one question. It is the biggest takeaway from Hard Knocks episode 2. I stayed up all night thinking about it. That question I'm turning over to you is, can Brian Daboll run a 7-second 40 time?
No, there's no way. Guy's out of his mind. You know what I mean?
Every scout and anyone that's ever watched football that is sitting around him is like, are you nuts? Are you? The best was like, you think you can run 2 seconds slower than that guy who just blazed the trail down the field? It was, I think it was like Rome Odunze. Like, you think you're 2 seconds behind Rome Odunze? Like, what yard line would I need to start at? They're like, you need to start at the 35, or else you would get burned by any of these guys. So you're of the mindset, no chance.
No, what do you? Honestly, you know, what'd be good. We should do this off pod. We should both try to run. We should try to run that and just see what times we put in. I'm not in particularly great shape. Brian Daboll has been getting fit. I love it. He's a few years older than me. If I can put down a time, I don't even know. I can't even begin to fathom what a normal human being runs when it comes to a 40 time. Because why? We're not watching human beings. We're watching the finite percentage of freak athletes. There are 300 plus pounders that could outrun me in a 40-yard dash because that's what you're watching. And Brian Daboll, you love the sport, you coach the sport, you eat, drink, and sleep the sport, but you don't play the sport. There's no way.
Simple answer that I'll say to you. Rich Eisen is a great
What does he run?
Sports commentator. He runs the 40. He's a guy that seems to be well in shape, right? Like he's 6 feet tall, relatively athletic. He runs the 40 every single year.
Yeah.
6.02. 5.97, 6 flat, 5.98. He's running a 6 is what he's doing.
Right.
Like, do you think
Brian Daboll's walking out there and running a 7?
Just a leg behind him? Because I don't know if that's the case. And I love Dabe's, but man, maybe with his new slim down physique, you never know, Adam. Listen, he said if you put a plate of chicken wings at the end of it, maybe he breaks 7 flat. Really,
my big takeaway was, God, Brian Daboll's so hungry now that he's slimmed down. He's just so hungry all the time. Just somebody put some food out there. I don't care if it takes me 30 minutes. The plate at the end of the rainbow. Guys, that's a One Giant Podcast episode that you just consumed. Thank you for being a part of it. Whether it's over on YouTube where you can subscribe and turn on the alerts on your podcast feeds, which greatly help us. Go subscribe on your podcast feeds. If you can leave a review, glowing 5 stars, greatly appreciated as well. Said we got some new things we're going to be talking about later in this week. We've got a lot of interviews from the Giants players currently on the roster, so tons to break down, continuing through the offseason, continuing towards the next Hard Knocks episode. But until the next time, until the best times, as Andrew Makowitz would want, need, and nay, demand the people know.
As always, let's go Big Blue.